I never thought I'd see the day when my own daughter would stand by silently as her husband threw my belongings onto our suburban street. "This is our home now, not yours," he shouted, his face twisted with contempt as my clothes scattered across the wet pavement. Neighbors peeked through their curtains, but no one came to help. I stood there, paralyzed, watching 67 years of my life reduced to a humiliating spectacle on Maple Avenue. Just 3 months ago, everything was different. I was sitting in my kitchen, the same kitchen my late husband Frank and I had renovated together 30 years earlier. The morning light streamed through the windows, highlighting the worn but polished oak table where our family had shared thousands of meals. I was sipping coffee when Sarah, my daughter, called. "Mum, Mark lost his job," she said, her voice tense. "The tech company downsized his entire department. We're struggling with the mortgage payments." I didn't hesitate. "Come stay with me until you get back on your feet," I offered. "The house is too big for just me anyway." Sarah's voice brightened immediately. "Are you sure? It would only be temporary, maybe a few months at most." "Family helps family," I replied, thinking of how Frank would have wanted me to support our only child. "The guest room is already set up." 2 weeks later, Sarah and Mark arrived with several suitcases and boxes. At first, everything seemed fine. Mark was polite, if somewhat reserved. He spent hours in their room, telling Sarah he was applying for jobs online. I gave them space, keeping to my routines of morning walks and afternoon gardening. In the evenings, we'd have dinner together, and I treasured having company again after 5 years of living alone since Frank's passing. The first sign that something was wrong came when I noticed small changes around the house. My photographs, including my wedding portrait with Frank, had been moved from the living room to the hallway. When I mentioned it to Sarah, she smiled nervously. "Mark thought it might be nice to update the decor a little," she explained. "He has such a good eye for these things." Then Mark began inviting friends over, loud gatherings that lasted late into the night. I'd lie awake upstairs, listening to unfamiliar voices and laughter below. Once I came downstairs at midnight to find strangers lounging on my sofa, drinking from Frank's cherished whiskey collection. "Mrs. Miller," Mark said, using my formal name despite knowing me for 8 years. "We thought you were asleep. Sorry if we disturbed you." "That whiskey was Frank's," I said quietly. "It's very special to me." Mark smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "We're just enjoying ourselves. Sarah and I are adults, after all." I retreated upstairs, unsettled by the exchange. The next morning, I tried to talk to Sarah alone, but Mark was always there, his arm draped possessively around her shoulders. Things escalated when I returned from my sister's house in Portland after a week-long visit. The key stuck in the lock, and when I finally pushed the door open, I froze. The entryway was completely different. My antique console table gone, replaced by a sleek modern piece I'd never seen before. I walked through the house in shock. The living room furniture had been rearranged, the dining room curtains replaced, and most of my personal items were nowhere to be seen. Upstairs, I discovered my bedroom door was locked. I knocked, confused. Mark opened it, looking annoyed. "Oh, you're back early." "This is my bedroom," I said, peering past him to see my belongings piled in corners, my bed now covered with their comforter. "We moved your things to the guest room," he replied casually. "This room gets better light for Sarah's yoga practice." I stood there, speechless, as Sarah appeared behind him. "Mom, we thought you wouldn't mind. The guest room is really cozy." That night, I couldn't sleep in the narrow guest bed. Something felt deeply wrong. I opened my laptop and checked my bank statement, a habit Frank had instilled in me. What I saw made my blood run cold. There were several large withdrawals I hadn't made, $5,000 to an unfamiliar account, then another $3,000 the following week. The next morning, I confronted Sarah at breakfast. "There's money missing from my account. Did you know anything about this?" Before she could answer, Mark walked in. His expression changed when he heard my question, hardening into something I'd never seen before. "Actually, Janet," he said, using my first name with a strange emphasis, "we need to talk about the house." "What about it?" I asked, my hands trembling slightly as I set down my coffee cup. Sarah and I have been thinking that since we're living here now, it makes sense for us to take over the property officially, he said smoothly. You're getting older, and managing a house this size is becoming too much for you. I looked at Sarah, waiting for her to contradict him, to stand up for me, but she just stared at her plate, silent. This is my home, I said firmly. Frank and I paid off the mortgage 15 years ago. Mark's smile disappeared. Well, that's not exactly how we see it. Little did I know that conversation was just the beginning of a nightmare I never saw coming. One that would leave me standing on the street, watching my son-in-law throw my clothes onto the pavement, while my daughter watched from the window, her face a mask I no longer recognized. The motel bed creaked as I sat down, still in shock, clutching the small bag of essentials I'd managed to grab before Mark slammed the door behind me. The room smelled of chemical cleaners and stale cigarettes, a far cry from the lavender sachets I'd placed in every drawer of the home I'd lived in for 35 years. Rain tapped against the window as night fell, matching the tears that wouldn't stop falling down my cheeks. What just happened? I whispered to myself, replaying the scene from hours earlier. Mark had been going through my desk when I caught him. When I demanded to know what he was doing, he exploded, saying the house was too cluttered with my junk and that I was becoming a burden. Before I could process what was happening, he was gathering my clothes from the dresser and throwing them onto the street, shouting that the house was theirs now. The worst part wasn't Mark's cruelty, it was Sarah's silent compliance. My daughter, who I'd nursed through chickenpox and heartbreaks, who I'd put through college with the money Frank and I had saved, stood in the doorway watching, her eyes vacant, as if looking at a stranger. After checking into the cheapest motel I could find, I called my sister Betty in Portland. "Janet, what's wrong?" she asked immediately, hearing the tremor in my voice. I tried to explain but broke down halfway through. When I finally composed myself, Betty's voice was steel. "This isn't right. Have you checked your documents, the deed to the house?" The deed. In the chaos, I hadn't even thought about it. "It's in my safety deposit box at First National," I replied. "Frank made sure everything was properly documented." "Good," Betty said firmly. "Tomorrow you go to that bank and check everything, then call me back." The next morning I washed my face in the motel's tiny sink and put on the same clothes from yesterday. The bank was only a 15-minute walk away. Despite the humiliation burning inside me, I held my head high as I entered the marble-floored lobby. "Mrs. Miller, it's good to see you," said Thomas, the manager who had known Frank and me for years. His smile faded when he noticed my distress. "Is everything all right?" "I need to access my safety deposit box," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. In the private room, I opened the metal box with shaking hands. The deed to the house was there, stating clearly that the property belonged to Frank and me, with Sarah as the beneficiary after both our deaths. Relief washed over me until I noticed something strange, a document I didn't recognize underneath. It was a power of attorney form, supposedly giving Sarah authority over my financial affairs. My signature was at the bottom, but I had no memory of ever signing it. Looking closer, I realized with horror that it wasn't my handwriting at all. "Thomas!" I called, my voice stronger now. "I need to show you something." Thomas examined the document, frowning. "Mrs. Miller, when did you sign this?" "I didn't," I said firmly. "That's not my signature." His expression grew serious. "If what you're saying is true, this is forgery, a criminal offense." I nodded, a cold certainty replacing my confusion. "And I think I know exactly who did it." After leaving the bank, I didn't return to the motel. Instead, I walked to the local library where I could use a computer privately. There, I logged into my email account and found dozens of notifications I'd never seen, password changes, account recovery attempts, and confirmations for financial transactions I hadn't made. Scrolling through my bank statements online revealed more unauthorized withdrawals, small enough not to immediately trigger alarm, but adding up to over $30,000 in the 3 months since Sarah and Mark had moved in. The timestamps showed most transactions happened during my morning walks or while I was visiting Betty. My hands trembled as I dialed Betty's number from the library's phone. They've been stealing from me systematically, I told her, my voice barely above a whisper, and they forged a power of attorney document. Janet, Betty said after a long pause, I'm coming to you, but first you need to call the police. I can't report my own daughter, I protested. If you don't, Betty countered, you might lose everything Frank worked so hard to provide for you. This isn't just about money, it's about justice. After hanging up, I sat staring at the computer screen, remembering something Frank used to say, trust but verify. He'd always been methodical about documentation, insisting we keep records of everything important. Would he have wanted me to pursue this legally, even against our only child? As if answering my question, an email notification appeared, a bank alert about a mortgage application submitted in my name. They were trying to take out a loan against my fully paid house. That was the moment something hardened inside me. This wasn't just opportunism. This was calculated theft. With newfound resolve, I called the police and explained my situation. 2 hours later, I sat across from Detective Harmon at the local precinct, spreading out printed copies of bank statements, the forged power of attorney, and screenshots of unauthorized email accesses. Mrs. Miller, said Detective Harmon, a woman about Sarah's age with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, what you're describing is elder financial abuse, identity theft, and forgery. These are serious crimes regardless of family ties. I never thought I'd be sitting here reporting my daughter and son-in-law, I admitted, the words bitter in my mouth. Detective Harmon nodded sympathetically. Unfortunately, financial abuse by family members is more common than people realize. You're doing the right thing by coming forward. As she took my official statement, I described the gradual takeover of my home, the isolation from friends, the subtle gaslighting that made me doubt my own perceptions. Each word felt like both a betrayal and a liberation. We'll need to investigate further and gather evidence, Detective Harmon explained. In the meantime, do you have somewhere safe to stay? My sister is coming tomorrow, I replied, thinking of Betty's fierce protectiveness. Before leaving the station, Detective Harmon handed me her card. Call me immediately if they contact you, or if you remember any other details. Walking back to the motel as dusk settled over the town, I felt a strange mix of sorrow and strength. The neighborhood I'd lived in for decades now seemed foreign to me. Through windows, I could see families having dinner together, the scenes of domestic harmony I'd once taken for granted. As I passed my house, I slowed down, observing from across the street. The porch light was on, illuminating the welcome mat I'd chosen years ago. Through the living room window I could see Mark pacing, gesturing angrily while talking on the phone. Of Sarah there was no sign. I turned away, continuing toward the motel, my mind racing with questions. How had my daughter changed so much? Had she always been capable of this deception, or had Mark's influence transformed her? And most pressingly, how would I reclaim not just my property, but my dignity? With each step, my determination grew. Tomorrow, with Betty by my side, I would begin the fight for everything that was rightfully mine. The documents in my bag weren't just papers. They were the first weapons in a battle I never wanted but was now prepared to win. Betty's rental car pulled into the motel parking lot at precisely 9 a.m., just as she'd promised. My sister had always been punctual, a trait that seemed especially comforting now when my world had lost all predictability. She stepped out, her silver bob gleaming in the morning sun, and wrapped me in a hug so tight it almost hurt. "You look terrible," she said bluntly, holding me at arm's length. That was Betty. No sugarcoating, even in crisis. "I feel terrible," I admitted as we settled in her car. "But I'm also angry, really angry." Betty nodded, starting the engine. "Good. We can work with anger." Our first stop was my attorney's office downtown. Michael Dawson had handled Frank's will and our estate planning for decades. His office still had the same leather chairs and faint smell of pipe tobacco, though Michael himself had aged considerably since I'd last seen him. "Janet, Betty," he greeted us solemnly, "I reviewed the documents you emailed. This is a clear case of fraud." For the next hour, we developed a strategy. Michael would file for an emergency injunction preventing any property transfers or new mortgages on my house. He would also send formal letters to all my financial institutions, alerting them to the fraud. "What about getting her back into her home?" Betty asked, the practical one as always. Michael leaned forward, his expression grave. "That's trickier. Technically, it's still your property, Janet, but removing occupants, even unwelcome ones, requires legal process. We'll need to coordinate with the police based on their fraud investigation." As we left his office, Detective Harmon called. "Mrs. Miller, we've made progress. The bank provided video footage confirming that Mr. Taylor attempted to cash several checks with your forged signature. We're building a solid case." "What about my house?" I asked, the question that had kept me awake all night. "We're preparing to execute a search warrant tomorrow morning," she explained. "We have reason to believe they possess additional forged documents and evidence of other crimes." The next 24 hours passed in excruciating slowness. Betty and I moved from the motel to a small Airbnb she found, where we sat drinking tea and reminiscing about our childhood, anything to keep my mind off what was happening. "Remember how Dad always said, 'The truth has a way of surfacing,'" Betty mused. I nodded, thinking of our father's weathered face and unwavering principles. Frank said something similar. He told me once that lies require constant maintenance, but the truth stands on its own. The call came at 11 a.m. the next day. "Mrs. Miller," Detective Harmon said, her voice conveying controlled excitement, "we've executed the search warrant. You should come down to the station." When we arrived, the detective led us to a conference room where a table displayed items recovered from my house, financial documents with forged signatures, copies of my identification they'd used for fraud, and, most disturbingly, a notebook in Mark's handwriting detailing their financial strategy for what they called the Janet situation. "We found evidence they were planning to sell your house and transfer the funds overseas," Detective Harmon explained. "They've been arrested and are being processed now." "Both of them?" I asked, my voice barely audible. "Sarah too?" The detective nodded, her expression softening. "I'm afraid so. The evidence suggests she was a willing participant." I sank into a chair, Betty's hand firm on my shoulder. Despite everything, hearing that my only child was in handcuffs felt like a physical blow. "There's something else," Detective Harmon added, sliding a folder across the table. "We found these in a locked drawer. Inside were photographs, dozens of them, of an unfamiliar woman with Mark. The timestamp showed they were taken throughout his marriage to Sarah, some as recent as last month. It appears Mr. Taylor has been maintaining another relationship for years," Detective Harmon explained. "We believe financial pressure from this double life may have motivated their scheme." The revelation didn't surprise me as much as it should have. It explained Mark's frequent business trips and late nights. What shocked me was Sarah's apparent willingness to participate in defrauding her own mother to finance her husband's deception. 2 officers escorted me back to my house that afternoon. The place felt both familiar and foreign, still my home, but now tainted by betrayal. In the kitchen, dirty dishes sat in the sink. In the living room, empty beer bottles and takeout containers littered the coffee table. "Do you want us to stay while you get settled back in, ma'am?" one officer asked. I shook my head. "No, thank you. My sister is coming. I'll be all right." After they left, I walked slowly through each room, assessing the damage. Most of my valuable antiques were gone, likely sold. My bedroom had been completely taken over, my personal items either discarded or stuffed into boxes in the garage. Standing in what had once been my sanctuary, I felt a wave of grief so intense it nearly knocked me down. I sat on the edge of the bed, now covered with Sarah's modern geometric duvet, and allowed myself to cry for everything lost. Betty found me there an hour later. Without a word, she began stripping the bed, removing all traces of Sarah and Mark. "We're going to reclaim this space," she announced, her voice brooking no argument. "One room at a time. Daily." Over the next week, we cleaned and reorganized. Friends from church brought casseroles and helped move furniture. Thomas from the bank personally delivered a box of family photos he'd kept in his office for safekeeping after I'd mentioned Mark's redecorating. Michael called with updates almost daily. The legal process would be lengthy, but the evidence was overwhelming. Mark faced significant jail time for fraud, forgery, and elder abuse. Sarah's sentence would likely be lighter due to her clean prior record, but she too would face consequences. "Do you want to press forward with all charges?" Michael asked during one call. "Some victims choose to reduce charges against family members." I thought about it for a long moment, remembering Sarah as a little girl with pigtails, as a teenager heading to prom, as a bride walking down the aisle. Then I thought of her standing silently while Mark threw my clothes into the street. "Yes," I said finally, "all charges. Frank always said that love doesn't mean enabling bad behavior." 3 months later, I sat in the courtroom as both Sarah and Mark were sentenced. Mark received 8 years for multiple felonies. Sarah, who ultimately cooperated with prosecutors, received 3 years probation and mandatory counseling, plus community service working with elderly victims of fraud. When the judge asked if I wanted to make a statement, I approached the podium, my hands steady on the paper, containing the words I'd carefully prepared. "The greatest loss in all this wasn't financial," I began, looking directly at my daughter for the first time since that terrible day. "It was trust. Money can be recovered, property can be reclaimed, but trust, once broken, leaves scars that never fully heal." Sarah's eyes filled with tears as I continued. "I don't know if I'll ever understand how my daughter could participate in trying to steal the home her father and I worked our entire lives to secure. But I do know this. Real love doesn't take. It gives. It protects. It honors sacrifices made by those who came before." I paused, gathering strength for my final words. "I hope someday you'll understand what you've thrown away was worth far more than whatever you hoped to gain." That evening, Betty and I sat on my porch swing, watching the sunset paint the neighborhood in gold. The house behind us was slowly becoming mine again, family photos back on walls, Frank's chair in its proper place, the smell of home-baked bread in the kitchen. "What now?" Betty asked, her shoulder pressed against mine. I considered the question, watching a young family walk by, their children laughing as they chased each other on the sidewalk. "Now I live," I answered simply. "I volunteer at the senior center to help others recognize signs of elder abuse. I finish the garden Frank and I planned. I make new memories in this house." The swing creaked gently as we rocked, a sound as familiar as my own heartbeat. Somewhere inside, the grandfather clock Frank had restored chimed 8 times. "And Sarah?" Betty asked quietly. I sighed, watching the last sliver of sun disappear behind the horizon. "That door remains unlocked. But she'll have to choose to walk through it herself, and she'll have to come with truth, not more lies." As darkness settled over the neighborhood, lights came on in houses up and down the street, windows glowing with the simple miracle of people in their rightful homes. My home had weathered a storm, but its foundation remained strong, and so I realized with quiet certainty, did I?